Welcome to our celebration this morning. As usual, I just love getting the opportunity to share with you some of the thoughts that are going on in my mind. And this year, the global consciousness of the Centers for Spiritual Living is focusing on a world that works for everyone. Centers all over are using that as their theme, as the overall annual theme. And then within that, in January, it's a tradition that we look at the first 4 books that Ernest Holmes wrote in this thing called You. I'm sorry, not in this thing called You, in his Science of Mind textbook. I like the thing called You, but in his Science of Mind textbook. And the first chapter is the thing itself. The second chapter, the way it works. The third one is what it does. The fourth one is how to use it. So those will be the topics that we'll be focused on throughout the month, through the eyes of this idea of rebooting our understanding of God and what exactly that means, and how it is that these teachings of Ernest Holmes can help us to create that world that works for everyone. And there are 5 Sundays, so the 5th Sunday, our practitioner Tina Bailey will be wrapping up the month for us and sort of pulling it all together. So I hope you come and get a sense of what it is that we're looking at this month and hear about and just sort of reboot your understanding of God and what it is that Ernest Holmes is teaching about God. Now, when we get updates, if you use computers, you know how they're constantly coming up with updates. And each time you allow that update to take place, you have to shut the computer off and reboot it so that it will take effect. And I think it's like that when we get new ideas. It's like we get a new idea, we get a new concept of something, and we kind of have to shut out the old, shut it off, and reboot how we behave, how we act, what we do with that new information, how we use that as we're thinking and moving through life. And I know, at least for me, my concept of God has changed several times throughout my life. So think back to the first time that you were aware of that idea, that there was God or spirit or a higher power, whatever term you use. What did you think about at that time? Who taught you about it? What were you taught about it? Did you visualize a him or a her, a being, an angel? Did you visualize kind of a ghost-like figure, a Santa Claus-like figure? Something that was mysterious or totally non-existent, something that you just couldn't even really put your mind around. What were the things that you were told about God? And then move yourself through your life a little bit as you started having different experiences and understandings in the world, as you grew up and left home and went out into the world. What was your understanding then? Did any of you ever feel afraid of God and what you were taught? Were you ever disappointed by God? Did you ever feel betrayed? Or did you have a deep connection, a sense of a connection with something grander than you? And did you feel that at any point? When did that start? In my progression of my experience with God, the first thing that I understood about God is that God healed. My mother would call a Christian Science practitioner whenever we didn't feel well. And so I didn't really understand the practitioner thing, so it just seemed like she'd call up God and she'd get off the phone and we'd feel better. So my understanding of God was that God healed. And then as I got older, I found my way into a church where I learned about God the Father. And God the Father was nurturing, but also very strict, punishing, and directive. And there was only one way to get on his good side. And that was difficult for me because I found it hard to believe that there was really only one way that people could get in this God's good graces, and everybody else was going you know where. That was hard. But I explored that, and I explored other religions and beliefs as I got into college, and eventually discovered God the Mother, the she concept. And she was nurturing, and she was all-encompassing, and in and through everything, she was the life giver. And I felt a connection with that a little bit more. But then as I continued on, all of those beliefs as the healer out there, that someone my mother could call, as the father, as the mother. It was all about something outside of me that I was sort of interacting with. As a child, I even talked to God a lot. I was terrified of the dark. And my parents believed in putting us to bed and shutting the door. So I would sit there holding my blanket that I kept all the way through college. I would hold my blanket and I would talk to God. And that would comfort me to the point where I could finally lay down and go to sleep. So God was also a comfort to me, something that I could talk to out there. Eventually, I came to understand God as love, as an energy. And that shifted things. I had to really reboot with that one because that was a whole different take on what God was. And when I got to that understanding, I found it difficult to apply it. I wasn't sure where to go with that idea, that God is just an energy, the energy of love that we have in the world. And it wasn't until I found religious science and Ernest Holmes' teachings that I began to understand how to apply that concept in my life, how I could make it work in a whole different way. And so my point this morning, as we talk about what it is that Ernest Holmes teaches, is not to say that he knows the way, the only way, and that he knows everything. And it's not to say that any one Holy Scripture, as we might call it, or any one book knows the way. And it's certainly not to say that my way is the only way. But it's to say that we each start where we are. We start with what it is we believe, what we've been taught, and then we allow ourselves to open to those updates, to new ideas, to new ways of looking at things, and then we reboot with those new ideas. But just like the computers, those new ideas and those new ways of doing things continue to come in constantly. I was told yesterday they come in daily. It's not like I can just update once a month anymore. You know, it's every day we have to look for those new ideas, those new things that are coming in. Ernest Holmes says, "It does not require an unusual degree of intelligence, but rather a practical application of what we now know in order that we may increase our knowledge." And further on, he says, "Let us approach the science of mind with awe, but not with fear, with truly a humble thought, but not with a sense that we are unworthy. Let us approach it normally, happily, willing to accept, glad to experiment." That's one of the phrases that I really like. Glad to experiment, hoping and believing that as the result of our efforts, we shall each derive a great good, a sound understanding of the natural laws of life as they apply to the individual and each one's relationship to the whole universal scheme of things. So that's the point in regard to why it is that we're looking at all this, that we're questioning, that we're asking these things, is to figure out how the natural laws work and how we might better work with them to increase our understanding of what's going on in the whole universal scheme of things. Further on, he says, "We accept this thing and believe in it. What we desire is to know more about it and how to use it." So how many of you, when you first heard about God, heard it referred to as the thing itself? That was a whole new concept, and it's a concept that is the name of this entire chapter that we're looking at. And it's a concept that, again, for me, was new. It brought a whole different feel to that idea of what I had been experiencing as God my whole life. And I think the key to all of this is when we reboot our computer, are we saying that what we had before we got the updates was wrong or bad? No, we're not. What we're getting is a new understanding, something that builds on top of what was already there. Somewhere, people who are interested in figuring out how to make computers do bigger and better things keep thinking, they keep using their mind to come up with new things, and they send them out there so we can apply them in our computer. And I think likewise, we are looking at what we've been taught, we look at our ideas of God, and then we can continue to expand them, take what works, and allow other stuff to kind of be part of our past. And in that way, we are rebooting our understanding of God and allowing that to apply. So how do we do that? What are some of the ways that we do that? Well, I'm always talking about classes. I think classes are really important because you read things and you get to discuss with other people, and there's a focus during a class on what it is you're looking at in your life and how you can apply these teachings. I think it's important that we stretch our thinking, that we allow ourselves to move beyond what it is we're thinking right now. We read all different kinds of books. I know a lot of us are reading right now God Without Religion, and this is stretching a lot of us in terms of our ideas of God. You read books about Ernest Holmes, or that Ernest Holmes wrote, Joel Goldsmith, other New Thought teachers. And sometimes you find things that stretch your thinking in places you never even expect it. A couple weeks ago, I spent a few days in bed reading all day, recuperating. And this book, I really cannot tell you where it came from. It was on my shelf, and I thought, oh, that wants to be read right now. It's called The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, The Fate of the World and What We Can Do Before It's Too Late by Throm Hartmann. And I thought, well, okay, that sounds interesting. Well, he spent about 2/3 of the book telling us what a dire straits the human condition is in right now. He talks about what's happening on our planet, what's happening between cultures, what people are doing to each other. And I kept thinking, why am I reading this? This is really depressing, and I already don't feel well. But I kept reading because he kept promising that he had an answer, that he had an idea that would help us to save ourselves as a society, as human race, and as a planet. So I kept reading and kept reading through all of the scientific stuff about how bad it is, rainforests, the whole 9 yards. Well, I finally got to where he starts to tell us what we can do, and imagine my surprise when he says, change our thinking. Change our thinking. Well, that's what Ernest Holmes has taught. Change your thinking, change your life. What he's talking about is changing not just our thinking in regard to our own person, but change our thinking in regard to our culture, the myths that we tell ourselves, the stories that we believe in, and how those are being played out. What Ernest Holmes would call our race consciousness. We have to change our thinking to actually change the race consciousness that's around us. He says in here, so we can now see that science is proving the existence of something it once thought disproved, the living nature of the universe and the interconnectedness of all things. And he talks about the importance of taking a step back then and seeing that interconnectedness of all things and figuring out how, if we think in those terms, that we're connected to everyone and everything, how that will change how we behave. And he talks about, he asked the question, how many people need to know this and to think this way in order for things to shift on this planet so that we can actually save the planet and not keep going in the direction that we're going? And he said he got a flyer from an organization that calls itself Only Love Prevails. And they claim that 80,000 people need to think this way, and that will shift the thinking in general of the whole planet. Just 80,000 people, and he's basing that on the ideas that physicists tell about, when you get two things together, sometimes the wave works at it works multiple times, and I don't understand all that part. But what I did get is that the 80,000 is the number that when every 80,000 people are thinking that way, that multiplies to basically be the entire number that was on the planet back when he wrote this in 2004. And then he says, but whatever the number, there's a synergistic effect in human interactions. The more people who think or believe a certain way, the more who will find it easy to think or believe that way. The more people who turn to searching for peace and divinity, the more will be found. And so that was quite a surprise to me to find that in that book. And also in this one, what he's saying is we need to change our myths, our stories. Again, the idea is we need to change our thinking so that we behave and act in the culture in a whole different way. I know originally when I found religious science, I felt like it was speaking to me about my own personal life, and that kind of just stopped there. I knew I needed to take care of me in my own personal life. And what I'm seeing now is that as we do that, and we share what we're doing and thinking out there, it starts to ripple out. And we get to have an experience that can actually change the direction of where we're headed. So as we're thinking about a world that works for everyone, that's a concept that I know for me was, and still is, sometimes difficult to picture. How do we get there? How do we stretch our thinking enough that we can make these changes out in the world? What do we need to do? Ernest Holmes says, we, by thinking, can bring into our experience whatsoever we desire, if we think correctly and become a living embodiment of our thoughts. This is not done by holding a thought, but by knowing the truth with a capital T. The riddle is solved, and we all use the creative power of the universal mind every time we use our own mind. And he points out we all have a mind. We all can use our thinking. And so one of the things that I have found that helps me is to ask questions. And I know I've said this many times before. That phrase that I got from a therapist however many years ago, less judgment, more curiosity. When I'm feeling judgment, if I can move myself into curiosity, whether it's judgment about myself or someone else, what's causing my reaction? Where is that coming from? What needs to be healed? I get curious about what's going on inside me when I'm having a response that I'm not comfortable with. Or if I see a behavior out in the world, what's going on in that person's life? What could have led to that type of behavior? Getting curious about it. I saw something on Facebook, I think it was just this morning. Someone posted, you've had way too much psychology when you can't get angry anymore because you understand what's gone on in everybody's life that led to that behavior. And yet, as we ask those questions, as we get curious, that helps us to change our thinking, to shift in our understanding of what's going on in the world. We can also ask, what if? Now, as we read, and we talk about these teachings, I know sometimes the teachings can be challenging to people. So instead of just saying, well, that is the way it is, just say, what if that is the way it is? So I've been told by a couple people here, but I don't like the idea of being one with those people. And they kind of jokingly say it, but it's also true. There's some people that make us so uncomfortable. The idea of being one with them is uncomfortable. So the question for me then is, but what if it's true? What if we are one with whatever those people, whoever they are, whatever they're doing? What if we're one? What difference does that make? How would that change anything? And would it? So we just ask the what if. What if it's true that our thinking can actually change what's going on in our life? What if? And then we take the time to contemplate. When we reboot or update things in our computer, and I don't know if I'm using all the correct terms, but what I know is that little thing starts twirling in the middle of the computer. Anybody watch that thing twirl? It goes around and around, and you're waiting and waiting and waiting. It takes time for all of that stuff to do what it does. And I think, likewise, it takes time in us. So just imagine that little thing twirling in your mind as you allow yourself to contemplate these ideas, to ask those questions. It takes time. We can't just keep plowing ahead without taking the time to contemplate, to imagine, to visualize. When we talk about a world that works for everyone, ever since I've heard that, which was before, right at the beginning when I started practitioner training, so several years ago, I've started taking time to picture what would that look like. I don't have all the answers. I sort of think of it in terms of when people first realized that there was electricity, but they really didn't quite know yet how to harness it to do things for us. Or the Wright brothers who knew that we could fly. They believed it, but they didn't quite know how to get from that vision or that thought and getting off the ground to actually doing it. So we're at a place where we can know that a world that works for everyone is possible. But how we're going to get there yet, that's still to be figured out as we think as we use our imagination, as we visualize. And I think one thing that's important to know is that if you allow your mind to kind of wander and contemplate like that, all of your thoughts are not set in stone. Every single thing we think doesn't come into reality, true? Sometimes, yeah, thank goodness. Sometimes we kind of let our mind wander and go, oh, I'm not sure I want to go down that path. So we start wandering down another path. Well, what if this? And that's part of what that process does. It gives us the freedom to experience things sort of in our mind's eye before we need to go through it in reality. And sometimes we can shift just by allowing ourselves the time to contemplate on that level. Then there's visioning, and there is a difference between visioning and visualization. The visioning is the process that I am offering to all of you after the service that we'll go through and vision for your new year of 2016. We're asking the question, what is Spirit's highest idea for us at this time as we move into the new year? And visioning is putting aside all of your old thinking, all of the stuff that's been running around in your mind, and just opening to something that could be brand new, a whole new thought. We sometimes wonder, where did that idea come from? Well, when we've cleared out the old stuff, there's room for sort of new ideas, things to come through. So we do that in the visioning process, and I'll get into that. Well, you'll experience it if you stay for the workshop. Well, one of the things that Ernest Holmes said that we read earlier is freedom is the birthright of every living soul. And this is an example of how our thinking needs to change. Because one of the things that Throm was explaining in his book is that the way that's been interpreted in the last 2,000 and maybe more years, and he points out that that's a very short time in the time that humans have been on this planet, is that if I am free, if freedom is my birthright, I can impose my will on others. I can actually own others and control others. And we got into a sense within our culture of what he called domineering or controlling, where people felt there were chosen people and they got to control the ones that were not chosen. That's a way of thinking. That's how that freedom was interpreted, is that we were free to do that. Now, as Martha read earlier from, again, this chapter, through experience, we learn what is really good and satisfying and what is truly worthwhile. As our intelligence increases and our capacity to understand the subtle laws of nature grows, we will gradually be set free. So there's where the question that we ask ourselves then is, what does it mean to be free? How does freedom really look if it's our birthright? What are we free to do? Those, to me, are the questions that we contemplate as we're rebooting, rethinking our idea of God and what God has told us to do or allows us to do. And we think about it in the framework of a world that works for everyone. What does freedom really look like? So like I said a little while ago, one of the things I love about religious science is that Ernest Holmes really encouraged us to experiment with the principles. We take these principles, we apply them, we try them out, sometimes just in our mind, and other times we try them out as we interact with people, and we figure out how they work for us. The Beyond Limits class, which we will be starting, will be looking at your concept of God. What is that? And how it might be shifted, expanded, how it might better serve you to come from a different angle, to upload something different in your ideas or concepts of God. We also look at prayer and treatment and how it works in different ways that you can use that in your life. If you've already taken Foundations or Beyond Limits, you're welcome to audit it again, because each time I reread what he teaches, I'm highlighting something different, because something new is speaking to me. I'm getting a new take on what it was he was teaching. And each time I sit with those thoughts, something new comes out of it. We're going to be offering Prosperity Plus again in the next couple months. And that's a place where we experiment with the law of abundance and how that works in our life. So we experiment, we try this stuff out, and each time you get something new. You get to upgrade, new applications, however you want to think about it. So just in this first chapter, and so one of the things that I encourage you all to do is get a Science of Mind textbook if you don't already have one. I don't know if they're in the pod. We used to have some in my office that you could borrow, but find one. I know COAS sometimes has them. We have them in the bookstore. And take yourself through these chapters as we go through each week. Little sentences, one sentence is enough to sit there and contemplate for quite a long time as you work through the week and read through it and just see what is inspired in you, what thoughts come to mind, how do you rethink some of your old thinking. Another thing, like I mentioned before, that we had in our past way of thinking is that some of us were chosen. This whole idea of being the chosen ones, and that we have that humans are superior to other life forms. And Ernest Holmes teaches in this first chapter, the universal principles are never respecters of persons. The universe has no favorites. How does that shift how we move in the world? The universe has no favorites. These principles work for everyone. Just like anyone who walks in here and turns on that switch is going to get the lights to come on. Those two. It works for everyone and in the same way. And he says the road to freedom lies not through mysteries and occult performances, but through the intelligent use of nature's forces and laws. He always says we need to work in conjunction with nature, with a capital N. The law of mind is a natural law in the spiritual world. We do not create the laws and principles, but discover and make use of them. And so again, that's where the science of mind comes in. He's talking about the fact that just like in science, there's a discovery of laws and how to work with them. That's how we got that plane off the ground, was understanding all kinds of laws that I can't even begin to list. But once they understood those laws, then they knew how to work with them to make that plane lift off the ground. And likewise in our spiritual practice, our spiritual life, there are spiritual laws that once we learn more about them and how to apply them, we can take off to greater and greater things in our lives. So I want to close with the final little piece of this chapter. I know you've heard it once, but I think it's worth repeating. If we try to find something difficult to grasp, then we shall never grasp it, because we shall always think of it, with a capital I, as being incomprehensible, it being God, the thing itself, Spirit. The mind which we discover within us is the mind that governs everything. This is the thing itself, and we should recognize its simplicity. So instead of thinking that doing all this stuff is too hard, it's beyond our capability, to recognize that just taking the time to contemplate and recognizing the simplicity of the thing itself is all we need to do. So stay tuned for next week and the way it works. And so it is.